Chapter 1. You're probably watching this because you still think about her more than you want to admit. Maybe she left. Maybe things faded slowly. Maybe the conversation ended with words that still echo in your head when the room gets quiet. Whatever the exact story is, there's a good chance part of you keeps wondering if she'll come back. Most men don't like saying that out loud, yet the thought sits there anyway. You remember the way she laughed, the way the connection felt when things were good, and somewhere in your mind, there's still a question about whether distance changes anything. Let's be honest about something that might feel uncomfortable for a second. A lot of men try to pull someone back by pushing harder when the connection starts slipping. They send longer messages. They ask deeper questions. They try explaining themselves in ways that sound thoughtful and sincere. The intention behind that effort is usually genuine. You want the relationship to survive. You want the person to understand how much you care. Yet the strange thing about attraction is how differently it behaves once pressure enters the situation. When someone pulls away emotionally, your instinct might tell you to move closer. The brain treats distance like a problem that needs solving. The longer the silence lasts, the more the mind starts producing explanations about what you could say to repair things. You start thinking about the perfect message, the right tone, the right words, something that shows her you're serious about the relationship. That instinct feels logical because communication solves so many other problems in life. Conversations help friends resolve misunderstandings. Honest discussions repair tension in families. Talking things through often brings clarity when people disagree. When a romantic connection begins drifting apart, it makes sense that your mind would reach for the same tool. Words feel like bridges that might reconnect two people who suddenly feel distant. Yet relationships have emotional currents that behave differently from ordinary disagreements. When someone steps away from a connection, the space that forms between two people becomes part of the experience itself. That space changes how both people think about the relationship. It changes the emotional rhythm that once existed when the connection was constant. A lot of men discover something surprising during that period of distance. The moment they stop chasing the conversation, the atmosphere around the situation begins shifting. The silence that once felt terrifying starts revealing things that constant communication never allowed either person to see clearly. Thoughts become quieter. Memories surface with more detail. Emotions settle into something more honest than the rush of reactions that happen when messages are flying back and forth. If you've ever gone through a breakup or a sudden pullback from someone you cared about, you probably remember how strong the urge was to reach out repeatedly. The brain hates unfinished emotional stories. It wants closure, answers, reassurance. When those things don't appear immediately, the mind tries to create them through conversation. Distance interrupts that impulse in a powerful way. When communication slows down or stops entirely, both people are left with their own thoughts. That experience feels uncomfortable at first. The silence carries weight because there's nothing distracting you from what you're feeling. The same thing happens on the other side of that distance. The person who stepped away also begins processing the relationship differently when the conversation disappears. Sometimes that quiet space becomes the place where memories start changing shape. When two people stop reacting to each other in real time, the mind begins reviewing the past more carefully. The good moments start standing out again. The conversations that once felt ordinary begin carrying more emotional significance. The connection that seemed easy to leave behind suddenly feels more complex when the daily interaction disappears. You might be wondering whether this experience actually leads someone to come back. That question sits quietly in the minds of many men who have gone through a breakup or emotional separation. People talk about it in different ways online, sometimes with a lot of dramatic language about strategies or psychological tactics. The reality behind those stories is usually simpler than the explanations surrounding them. Distance changes how people remember each other. When someone steps away from a relationship and the other person doesn't chase them, The emotional narrative inside their mind continues evolving. The absence of communication creates a space where curiosity can return. Questions appear where certainty once existed. The interesting thing about curiosity is how powerful it becomes when nothing interrupts it. When someone leaves a relationship and the other person constantly messages them afterward, their mind stays focused on the present conversation. When silence appears instead, the mind begins wandering back into the past. It starts exploring memories that weren't visible during the emotional tension that led to the separation. You might remember a moment in your own life when distance changed how you felt about someone. Maybe it was an old friend you hadn't spoken to in years. Maybe it was someone you dated briefly who crossed your mind later in a completely different way. Time and distance have a strange ability to reshape emotional memory. The same thing sometimes happens in romantic relationships. When two people stop interacting daily, the emotional picture inside their minds begins rearranging itself. The moments that felt meaningful gain more clarity. The conflicts that once dominated conversations lose some of their intensity. Distance allows both people to revisit the connection from a calmer place. That doesn't guarantee someone will return. Life moves forward for everyone. Still, the pattern appears often enough that many people notice it. When distance enters the story and the emotional pressure disappears, curiosity begins growing quietly in the background. You might have experienced a small version of this already. Maybe someone who once seemed distant suddenly reached out weeks later with a simple message. Maybe the conversation started casually before turning into something deeper. Those moments surprise people because they appear after long periods of silence. If you're listening to this and remembering a moment where someone reappeared in your life after distance created space, you're not the only one. Stories like that show up in conversations between friends all the time. People rarely understand exactly why those reconnections happen, yet the pattern feels familiar to many who have lived through it. Sometimes hearing those experiences from others helps people realize that distance isn't always the end of a story. If you've had a moment where someone came back into your life after time passed between you, share that story in the comments. Those experiences often reveal how relationships change shape when space enters the equation. What matters most during that period of distance is how you move through your own life while the silence exists. The way you carry yourself, the way you rebuild your rhythm, the way you reconnect with your own direction begins shaping the emotional atmosphere around the entire situation. That atmosphere becomes the foundation for everything that happens afterward. Distance isn't simply about waiting for someone to return. It becomes the space where your own clarity grows and where the meaning of the relationship begins revealing itself in ways that constant conversation rarely allows. Chapter 2. Let's sit with something for a second that most men don't like admitting to themselves. When she leaves and you keep reaching out, it changes the emotional gravity of the situation. The moment she senses that your energy is revolving around her decision, the entire dynamic becomes tilted in a direction that quietly drains attraction. That realization stings a little because the intention behind reaching out usually comes from care, loyalty, or confusion. You want answers. You want the connection back. You want the story to make sense again. Still, the emotional atmosphere created by constant pursuit has a very specific effect on how people experience distance. When someone knows you're always there waiting, always ready to respond, always thinking about them, a certain kind of tension disappears. That tension might sound negative at first, yet it plays a powerful role in attraction. The human mind tends to notice things more intensely when they feel slightly uncertain. Distance introduces uncertainty naturally. The moment communication stops, the rhythm that once existed between two people disappears. The daily interactions vanish. The familiar messages stop appearing. That silence creates a space where the mind begins asking questions it never asked before. Those questions appear quietly at first. They show up while someone is driving somewhere, while they're sitting alone, while they're thinking about the past without any new conversation interrupting their thoughts. One of the most common experiences during this time is the return of emotional contrast. While two people are constantly interacting, the connection can begin feeling predictable. Predictability doesn't feel dramatic in the moment, yet it slowly flattens the emotional landscape of the relationship. When distance appears, the absence of that interaction changes how the mind experiences memory. Suddenly, the things that once felt ordinary begin feeling meaningful again. A woman who stepped away from a relationship often carries a certain emotional certainty during the moment she leaves. Her decision might feel clear to her because she's been thinking about it privately for some time. That certainty exists within the environment of the relationship as it currently feels. Once distance removes the daily interaction, the emotional environment surrounding those thoughts begins shifting. Without constant communication reinforcing the reasons she left, the mind begins drifting back toward the moments that once felt good. The laughter appears again in her memory. The late-night conversations return with more warmth. The small habits that once made the relationship feel comfortable begin resurfacing. None of those memories were erased when the relationship ended. They were simply overshadowed by whatever tension existed at the time. Distance changes the balance between those memories and the emotions that led to the separation. When the daily interaction disappears, the mind has space to revisit the relationship with a different emotional tone. That process happens slowly and often without conscious intention. It's simply how memory works when people step away from a situation that once felt intense. You might have noticed this dynamic in other parts of your life as well. Think about a place you used to visit regularly, maybe a restaurant, a neighborhood, or even a job you once held. When you were there every day, certain parts of the experience felt frustrating or exhausting. Once you left and enough time passed, the memory of that place began feeling softer. The good moments started standing out more clearly than the difficult ones. Relationships follow a similar emotional pattern. The human mind reorganizes memories once the constant interaction disappears. When two people remain in contact immediately after a breakup, that reorganization struggles to happen because the emotional environment keeps refreshing itself with new reactions. Silence interrupts that cycle and gives memory room to breathe. For the man experiencing distance, this phase can feel confusing. One day you might feel completely ready to move forward. The next day, a memory appears that brings the entire relationship back into focus. That emotional movement is part of how the mind processes loss. Each quiet day shifts the perspective slightly until the situation begins making sense in a broader way. Meanwhile, the absence of your presence begins changing how she experiences the story as well. The conversations that once filled her day with you no longer exist. The jokes, the shared observations, the familiar rhythm of communication disappears completely. Human beings tend to notice absence more strongly than presence. When something familiar disappears, the mind begins exploring the space it left behind. That exploration sometimes turns into curiosity. Curiosity doesn't arrive dramatically. It appears as small thoughts at first. She might wonder how you're doing. She might remember something you said weeks ago that suddenly feels different in her memory. She might find herself revisiting parts of the relationship she hadn't thought about since the moment she left. Those moments happen quietly and often unexpectedly. They appear because distance removed the emotional noise that once surrounded the relationship. Without new arguments, explanations, or emotional reactions entering the story, the mind begins reviewing the connection on its own terms. You may have seen this happen before in your own life. Someone who once seemed completely certain about leaving eventually reached out again after weeks or months of silence. That message often arrives casually. Sometimes it's just a simple question about how you've been. Sometimes it references a memory you shared together. Those small openings reveal how distance reshaped the emotional landscape inside that person's mind. If you're listening to this and remembering a moment where someone reappeared in your life after a long silence, you're not alone. Many people have experienced that quiet shift in a relationship where time changed the way both people understood what they once had. If that moment happened to you, drop a comment and share how long the distance lasted before the conversation started again. Hearing those timelines often surprises people who assume silence always means the end. What matters most during the stage isn't predicting whether someone will come back. It's recognizing how distance changes the emotional story for both people involved. Silence slows everything down. It removes the pressure of immediate reactions. It allows memory and reflection to work in ways that constant conversation never allows. When you move through that silence with composure, something interesting begins happening inside you as well. Your attention returns to your own life. The emotional energy that once revolved around the relationship begins spreading into other parts of your world. That shift changes how you carry yourself, and that change becomes part of the story distance is writing between you and the person who stepped away. Chapter 3. You probably remember the exact moment the silence began. Maybe it wasn't announced with dramatic words. Sometimes distance just appears quietly. Messages slow down, replies get shorter. A conversation that used to feel effortless starts carrying a strange tension inside it. Eventually, there's a moment where the connection simply stops moving forward, and suddenly, you're sitting there with a phone in your hand, wondering how something that once felt alive became quiet so quickly. The first days after that kind of separation are usually the hardest for most men. Your brain keeps replaying the last conversations looking for clues. You read old messages again, trying to decode what changed. There's a strong urge to send something, anything, just to break the silence. The mind starts constructing sentences in advance. You imagine what she might say back. You imagine how the conversation might restart if you choose the right words. It's strange how powerful that urge can be. Even men who consider themselves calm and emotionally disciplined often feel that internal pressure during the first stage of distance. You're not just missing the person, you're missing the rhythm that existed between you. The small interactions, the familiarity, the sense that someone else was part of your daily world. Yet something important begins happening the moment you resist the impulse to chase that conversation. At first, it doesn't feel empowering at all. In the beginning, it feels like restraint. It feels like holding back energy that wants to move somewhere. The silence can feel heavy because you're aware of it constantly. But silence has a quiet power inside relationships that many people underestimate. When you stop trying to control the outcome of the situation, the emotional environment begins rearranging itself naturally. The pressure that once surrounded the relationship dissolves slowly. The intensity of the breakup or separation loses its immediate emotional heat. Inside that calmer atmosphere, both people start experiencing the story differently. The man who gives distance often begins rediscovering parts of himself that were overshadowed during the emotional turbulence of the breakup. You start focusing on things that existed before the relationship became the center of your attention. Work feels clearer. Conversations with friends feel more grounded. Your thoughts begin stretching beyond the narrow circle of what happened between you and her. At the same time, something subtle begins happening inside her mind as well. The version of you that existed during the breakup was shaped by emotional tension. She saw you reacting to the situation. She heard the explanations, the questions, maybe even the frustration. When distance appears and communication stops, that emotional snapshot begins fading. Without new reactions reinforcing that image, her mind starts remembering you differently. The version of you that appears in her thoughts becomes the broader version she knew before the relationship reached its breaking point. the moments where you made her laugh, the times you surprised her with something thoughtful, the energy you carried when the connection felt exciting instead of heavy. Memory has a way of selecting moments that carry emotional weight. When someone disappears from daily interaction, the mind naturally revisits the experiences that left the strongest impression. Sometimes those memories arrive unexpectedly. A song might remind her of a moment you shared together. A place she passes might trigger a conversation she once had with you. Those small reminders begin stitching together a new emotional picture inside her mind. The breakup itself slowly becomes one moment within a much larger story, instead of the defining conclusion of the relationship. The silence gives that story space to breathe. You might be wondering why distance seems to affect attraction so strongly. Part of the reason lies in how people experience emotional presence. When someone is constantly available and constantly reacting to the situation, their emotional position becomes predictable. Predictability feels comfortable in stable relationships, yet during a breakup, it often reinforces the feeling that the relationship has already run its course. Distance interrupts that predictability. When she no longer knows what you're thinking or what you're doing, curiosity begins creeping back into the emotional space between you. The mind naturally wonders about people who disappear from its daily routine. That curiosity doesn't always turn into action immediately, yet it changes the way the relationship lives inside her thoughts. You've probably felt that same curiosity in other situations. Think about a friend you haven't heard from in years who suddenly crosses your mind out of nowhere. There's something about absence that invites reflection. The mind starts exploring possibilities it never considered when the person was part of your everyday environment. The same thing can happen with romantic relationships. When communication disappears, the mind begins asking questions about the person who is no longer there. What are they doing now? How are they handling the breakup? Did they move on quickly? Are they happier without the relationship? Those questions appear quietly at first. They show up in moments when the mind is relaxed and wandering. Curiosity grows slowly because there's nothing interrupting it with immediate answers. That curiosity becomes part of the emotional gravity pulling attention back toward the person who stepped away. If you've ever experienced a situation where someone who once seemed completely certain about leaving eventually reached out after weeks or months of silence, you've already seen this process in motion. The message might arrive casually, almost as if nothing dramatic happened before. A simple greeting, a small reference to something familiar between you. When that moment arrives, it often surprises the man who experienced the breakup. During the early days of silence, it felt impossible that she would ever think about him again. Yet time and distance changed the emotional atmosphere surrounding the relationship. This is where many men make a mistake if the conversation restarts. The moment she reaches out again, the temptation to immediately reattach emotionally becomes strong. You might feel the urge to dive back into long conversations about the past. You might want to explain everything you've been thinking since the separation. Yet the same principle that allowed curiosity to grow in the first place still exists. Emotional space is what created the shift in her perception. When the connection begins forming again, maintaining a calm and grounded presence becomes more powerful than rushing to recreate the intensity of the old relationship. The story you're living through during distance isn't only about whether someone comes back. It's about how the emotional dynamic between two people transforms when silence enters the equation. That silence reveals how much of attraction depends on the energy people carry within themselves, rather than the words they say during moments of conflict. If you've ever experienced a moment where giving someone distance changed the entire direction of a relationship, share that experience in the comments. A lot of men assume silence always means failure, yet the stories people tell often reveal something more complicated happening beneath the surface. Chapter 4. At some point during that silence, something inside you starts shifting whether you planned it or not. The first phase of distance usually revolves around her. Your thoughts circle around what she's doing, what she's thinking, whether she misses you, whether she regrets the decision. That stage can last days or weeks, depending on how deep the relationship was. The mind keeps returning to the same questions because it's trying to resolve an unfinished emotional loop. Then, slowly, almost quietly, the focus begins moving somewhere else. You wake up one morning and realize you didn't think about her immediately. The day moves forward with other things occupying your attention. Work demands your focus. Conversations with friends feel normal again. Life starts filling the spaces that once belonged entirely to that relationship. That shift doesn't mean the connection disappears from your memory. It simply means the emotional center of gravity begins returning to your own life. The silence that once felt like a void becomes something different. It becomes space. Space to breathe, space to think clearly, space to rebuild a rhythm that belongs entirely to you. Something interesting happens during that phase of distance that many men don't notice at first. The version of you that existed during the relationship begins evolving. When two people spend a lot of time together, they naturally adjust parts of themselves around each other. Certain habits change, certain priorities shift. Your emotional energy flows toward the connection because it feels meaningful. Once that connection disappears from your daily routine, the energy that once fed the relationship begins returning to you. You start exploring interests you might have neglected. You spend time improving parts of your life that had been sitting quietly in the background. That transformation often happens gradually without a dramatic decision behind it. It's simply the natural direction your energy moves once it's no longer orbiting someone else. From the outside, that shift changes how you appear to other people. Your posture feels different. Your conversations carry a different tone. There's a subtle sense of direction inside your actions because your attention has returned to your own path. You're not performing this change for anyone. It's simply the result of reclaiming your focus. That energy travels further than most men realize. People notice when someone moves through life with a quiet sense of purpose. Friends see it, colleagues notice it, and sometimes the person who stepped away from the relationship begins sensing that change as well. You might be wondering how she could possibly notice something if you're not speaking to her. The answer lies in how social environments work. Even when two people aren't communicating directly, the world around them still carries signals. Mutual friends mention things casually. Social media posts reveal glimpses of your life. Even the tone of silence itself can communicate something. When she sees that you're continuing forward with confidence instead of chasing the past, the story she tells herself about you begins evolving again. During the breakup, the narrative inside her mind might have centered around the problems that existed between you. Distance allowed the emotional tension to settle. Now the version of you she observes from afar carries a different presence. That presence can spark something powerful inside the human mind. Re-evaluation. The mind starts revisiting earlier assumptions when new information appears. The man she remembers from the breakup is no longer the only version of you visible in the story. Now there's a version of you who seems steady, focused, and unaffected by the silence between you. That realization often produces a strange emotional response. The certainty she once felt about leaving begins softening. Questions start forming. Has he moved on? Is he happier now? Did I misread the situation? Those questions don't appear because you tried to convince her of your value. They appear because your actions quietly demonstrated that your life continued evolving without the relationship. There's a moment in many distant stories where curiosity becomes strong enough to turn into action. It might happen after several weeks. Sometimes it takes months. One day a message appears unexpectedly. The tone is often casual, almost light. She might reference something familiar between you. She might simply ask how you've been. When that moment arrives, it often feels surreal for the man who experienced the breakup. For weeks, the silence felt permanent. The idea that she would reach out seemed unrealistic. Yet distance has a way of reshaping emotional stories in ways people rarely predict. Here's something important to understand about that moment. Her reaching out doesn't mean everything instantly returns to the way it was before. The silence that existed between you changed both of you in subtle ways. The connection that forms again, if it forms, begins as something new rather than a continuation of the old dynamic. This is where your mindset becomes crucial. If you respond with desperation or emotional intensity, the old imbalance can reappear quickly. The same pressure that pushed the relationship toward distance might start building again. On the other hand, if you respond with calm presence, the conversation can unfold naturally without carrying the emotional weight of the past. A lot of men struggle with this stage because the urge to secure the relationship again becomes strong. You might want reassurance that she isn't going to disappear again. You might want clarity about what she's feeling. Those desires are understandable, yet the power of distance came from allowing the emotional space between you to exist without forcing immediate resolution. Maintaining that calm rhythm during the early stages of reconnection allows the relationship to grow in a healthier direction if it continues developing. The silence you experience together becomes part of the foundation of the new connection rather than a problem you're trying to erase. If you've ever experienced a situation where someone reached out after weeks or months of distance, think about how that conversation actually began. Most of the time it wasn't dramatic. It was simple, casual, almost curious. That simplicity reveals how distance slowly rewrites emotional stories without either person needing to force the outcome. If you're listening to this and remembering a moment when someone came back into your life after a long silence, share how it happened in the comments. Those stories often remind people that distance doesn't always mean the end. Sometimes it becomes the space where a connection quietly reorganizes itself into something new. Chapter 5. There's a moment that happens eventually, whether she comes back or not, and it's a moment a lot of men don't talk about because it doesn't look dramatic from the outside. It's quiet, almost ordinary. One day you realize the silence between you and her doesn't control your emotions anymore. The weight that once sat in your chest when you thought about the breakup feels lighter. The story that once replayed constantly in your mind starts losing its grip. That realization usually arrives without ceremony. You might be driving somewhere, or finishing work, or sitting with your phone in your hand after a long day. Her name crosses your mind the same way it always has, but this time something feels different. Instead of the usual rush of emotion, there's space around the thought. The memory still exists, yet it no longer dictates how the rest of your day unfolds. That shift reveals something important about distance that many men misunderstand in the beginning. Distance isn't only something that changes how she sees you, it's something that changes how you see yourself. When the relationship first ends, the emotional gravity pulls your attention toward the loss. Everything feels like it revolves around the absence she left behind. Over time, that gravity weakens. The focus of your life slowly moves back toward your own direction. The habits you rebuild, the conversations you have with other people, the progress you make in your work or personal goals begin creating a new emotional center inside your life. That center doesn't depend on whether she returns. It exists because you continued moving forward, even while the silence remained. This is the part of the story where many men discover something unexpected. When you genuinely reach that place of emotional balance, the question about whether she will come back stops feeling urgent. The curiosity might still exist in the background, but it no longer defines your sense of peace. Your life has momentum again. Your days carry purpose. The relationship becomes one chapter in a larger story instead of the entire narrative. Ironically, that stage is often when the possibility of reconnection becomes the healthiest, if it happens at all. When distance first begins, both people are usually reacting to emotional turbulence. Decisions made in that environment tend to carry the energy of unresolved tension. When enough time passes and both people regain their individual stability, the dynamic between them can shift into something clearer. If she reaches out during that phase, you'll notice something subtle about your reaction. The message doesn't create the same emotional shock it might have created weeks earlier. You read it calmly. You consider your response without urgency. There's a sense of composure inside you because your life no longer feels paused, waiting for her decision. That composure is powerful because it reflects genuine independence rather than a strategy. She can feel the difference in the tone of your conversation. You're present, open, and relaxed instead of anxious about the outcome. That emotional stability changes the atmosphere of the interaction in ways that are difficult to fake. Sometimes the conversation grows naturally from there. Two people reconnect and rediscover the parts of the relationship that once felt meaningful. The silence between them becomes a reference point rather than a wound. They move forward carefully, aware that the dynamic between them has evolved. Other times, the conversation remains brief. You exchange a few messages, you catch up on life. The interaction ends with a sense of closure that didn't exist during the breakup. That outcome might not look dramatic either, yet it carries its own kind of peace. The unanswered questions that once filled your mind finally settle into something understandable. Either way, the distance served a purpose. It allowed both people to step outside the emotional storm that existed when the relationship ended. It gave memory time to rearrange itself. It gave identity space to grow beyond the version of life that revolved around the connection. A lot of men approach distance hoping it will function like a switch that flips attraction back on. Life rarely works with that level of precision. Distance isn't a trick or a technique. It's simply the natural environment that appears when two people stop interacting and allow time to pass. What happens inside that environment depends on many things: personal growth, emotional maturity, the strength of the original connection. Yet the reason distance often leads to someone coming back is surprisingly simple. Silence allows people to experience the relationship without the emotional pressure that once surrounded it. Memory becomes clearer. Curiosity returns. The absence of daily interaction reminds the mind what the presence of that person once felt like. You can't control exactly how someone else processes those experiences. What you can control is how you live your own life during the time that passes between you. When your focus returns to your own direction, something shifts in the energy you carry through the world. That energy becomes visible to others, even when you're not trying to show it. If you're listening to this right now while going through a breakup or a period of distance, remember that the silence you're experiencing isn't empty. A lot is happening inside it. Both of your minds are processing the story in ways that constant conversation would never allow. The absence of communication is quietly shaping how the relationship will be remembered and understood. One day you might hear from her again. That message might appear in a way you never expected, or the silence might continue long enough that the chapter closes completely. Either outcome can lead you toward the same place if you allow the distance to reshape your focus. Your life continues expanding regardless of what happens between you and her. The goals you pursue, the habits you build, the person you become during that time will matter far more in the long run than any single relationship. Distance simply reveals how much of your strength already existed before the connection began. If this conversation resonated with you and reminded you of a moment where distance changed the direction of a relationship in your life, leave a comment and share your experience. Stories like that help other men realize they're not the only ones navigating the strange emotional terrain that silence creates after a breakup. And if you found value in hearing this perspective, Subscribe and stick around because there are many conversations like this where we explore the quiet dynamics behind relationships that most people never stop long enough to understand.